Welcome to the debate. Usually when we measure human traits like height or even blood pressure, there's an expectation of mechanical precision.
Right. It's straightforward. You step on a scale and the number is just the number.
Exactly. It's objective, it's external, and it requires zero interpretation. But then you step into the world of measuring self-awareness, and suddenly that scale is just completely broken.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. And why? Because the instrument doing the measuring is the exact same thing as the object being measured. I mean, it's the human mind.
It is the absolute definition of a methodological hall of mirrors. You are literally asking the brain to objectively evaluate its own subjectivity.
Yes, and today we are exploring a really fascinating attempt to break those mirrors. We're looking at the Self-Awareness Outcomes Questionnaire, or SAOQ.
Right. Developed by Anna Sutton back in 2016.
That's the one. It's a 38-item self-report tool, and it evaluates the frequency of outcomes related to self-awareness. It operates across 4 distinct subscales: reflective self-development, acceptance of self and others, proactivity at work, and emotional costs.
Which is a lot to unpack.
It is. So the central question we are tackling today is this: does measuring the downstream outcomes of self-awareness successfully bypass the metacognitive challenges of measuring self-awareness itself? Or does it fundamentally conflate the psychological trait with its circumstantial side effects?
That's the real crux of it.
I will be arguing that focusing on concrete outcomes is a highly pragmatic and, honestly, a psychometrically robust way to capture self-awareness in the real world. And today I'm joined by my co-host, who will argue that this outcome-based, self-report approach rests on a profound methodological paradox.
That is exactly right. I will be making the case that you really just cannot bypass the fundamental problem of self-reporting. By leaning on circumstantial behaviors, this tool risks taking a pure psychological construct and stretching it so thin that it loses all operational meaning.
Okay, let me start by laying out why the SAOQ is such a necessary innovation in the field of psychology. Look, if you want to measure self-awareness directly, you run into an immediate, insurmountable problem.
The cognitive blind spot.
Exactly. The cognitive blind spot. The people who most lack self-awareness are precisely the ones who are least equipped to report on their lack of it. Think of it like this. If you are listening to this on your commute, you might be thinking, well, I know I'm self-aware because I think about my actions all the time.
Sure, everybody thinks they're self-aware.
Right. But what if your perception of those actions is completely divorced from reality? If I ask someone, are you highly self-aware? And they aren't, they might confidently say yes, entirely ignorant of their own ignorance.
Which happens all the time.
Exactly. So Sutton's theoretical brilliance here is a pivot. By measuring the day-to-day impacts of awareness, things like having compassion for others, modifying your behavior to be useful, or recognizing stress in your environment, the tool systematically avoids those traps.
Or so it claims.
Well, it does. It isn't asking you to evaluate your own cognitive architecture. It's asking you to report on your lived experience using a simple 5-point scale. And the internal consistency is undeniably strong. We're talking high Cronbach's alpha values here, like 0.87 for reflective self-development and 0.83 for acceptance. The math supports the structure.
Well, I come at it from a different way. I will readily acknowledge the rigorous item generation process here.
It was incredibly rigorous.
It was. Sutton and her team didn't just pull these statements out of the ether. They drew from prior research, they ran expert focus groups, and they systematically whittled an initial pool of 83 items down to the final 38.
Which is good, diligent science.
It is diligent science, but, and this is a massive but, the SAOQ falls into the exact metacognitive trap it claims to avoid.
How so? The items are explicitly focused on outcomes rather than the internal trait itself.
Are they really just outcomes, though? Let's look at the actual text on the questionnaire. Item 18 asks the respondent to rate the frequency of the statement. I understand myself well.
Okay.
Item 25 asks them to rate. I have insight into myself. We have to pause and ask, how on earth are those measuring an external outcome?
Well, having insight,
Relying on a respondent to accurately self-report that they have insight, still requires that person to possess the very metacognitive accuracy the tool is explicitly trying to bypass. You are conflating how someone feels about their level of self-awareness with actual verified reality.
I think you're...
Just imagine a true narcissist taking this test. If a narcissist genuinely believes they have deep, profound insight into themselves, they will circle almost always for item 25. Conceptually, that is incredibly dangerous if we are relying on this tool to establish an objective psychological baseline.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning at all, because you are demanding a level of direct external observation that simply doesn't exist when evaluating internal psychological states.
But we need some objective grounding.
Sure, but we can't put a dipstick into a person's brain to check their awareness oil levels. So instead, the SAOQ checks the engine's performance. It's like, if you cannot see the wind, you measure the rustling of the leaves.
Okay, poetic.
The SAOQ measures the leaves, and we know this works because of how the researchers establish construct validity. In simple terms, they tested their new tool against older, proven tools to see if the results line up.
Right, well, let's look closely at how those results line up then.
We absolutely should. Take the acceptance of self and others subscale. They tested this against a completely different metric designed to measure rumination.
Right, rumination.
Yeah, that terrible obsessive overthinking. The 2 a.m. panic where you replay a conversation in your head a dozen times.
We've all been there.
Exactly. Well, the data shows a strong negative correlation, an R value of negative 0.27, between the SAOQ's acceptance scale and rumination. Meaning, as a person's acceptance score definitively goes up, their obsessive overthinking undeniably goes down. This is the smoking gun.
Is it, though?
Yes, it proves the tool successfully isolates healthy, productive self-awareness from mere neurotic self-obsession. We are measuring people who have reached a state of healthy acceptance. The engine is running smoothly.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You bring up the drop in rumination as this massive victory for the acceptance subscale, but you are completely ignoring the data from the other subscales in the exact same paper.
I'm not ignoring it. They measure different...
Hear me out. The emotional costs subscale of the SAOQ has a highly significant mathematical link to an increase in rumination, an R value of 0.31, and it simultaneously correlates with an increase in mindfulness with an R value of 0.22. Do you see the profound contradiction there?
It's not a contradiction. It's complexity.
You are telling me that a single underlying trait, self-awareness, is simultaneously validated by a decrease in rumination over here and an increase in rumination over there. How can both of those be true markers of the exact same psychological construct?
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. Look, human psychology is rarely a single, clean vector.
Understatement of the year.
High self-awareness naturally produces divergent outcomes depending on where the individual is in their journey. Early on, becoming hyper-aware of your flaws causes rumination. Those are the emotional costs. Later, as you integrate that knowledge, it leads to acceptance, which acts as an antidote and reduces rumination. The SAOQ is uniquely powerful precisely because it captures the entire ecosystem of the trait.
But an ecosystem is exactly what a psychometric tool is supposed to disentangle. If your tool for measuring the wind tells me the leaves are blowing both east and west simultaneously, the tool isn't isolating the variable. It is just describing the weather.
Well, describing the weather is the first step to predicting it.
And when we use self-reporting for both the acceptance outcome and the rumination outcome, we run into a major issue known as common method variance.
Oh, come on. Common method variance is...
To put it simply, people answer questions based on the character they play in their own heads. A person who believes they are a highly evolved, enlightened individual will score themselves highly on items like I am objective, which is item 14, by the way, and low on rumination simply because that fits their self-concept. It doesn't mean it's objectively true. The circularity is inescapable.
You're arguing that internal feelings are too easy to fake on a test, or too influenced by self-concept. Fair enough. But that's exactly why Sutton didn't stop at internal feelings. She moved to external, observable reality.
You mean the workplace?
Specifically, how people act in the office. This brings us to the proactivity at work subscale.
A fascinating and frankly highly debatable addition to the tool.
It is intensely practical. This subscale includes items like item 31, I take control of my work, or item 27, I have changed the way I work. It reliably correlates with mindfulness at an R value of 0.21 and self-reflection at 0.31.
Sure, the numbers are there, but what do they mean?
Think of the middle manager who suddenly realizes they micromanage their team because of their own personal anxiety. Once they gain that insight, they actively change their workflow to give their team more autonomy. This is the SAOQ successfully bridging the gap between internal insight and tangible professional initiative. And psychometrically, it proves that self-awareness translates into observable action. It gets things done in the real world.
That's a compelling narrative, I'll give you that. But we really need to address the glaring methodological anomaly sitting right there in the source material regarding this specific subscale.
If you're talking about the lack of correlation with formal self-awareness practices like meditation or journaling, I don't see that as an anomaly at all. I see it as a reflection of how learning actually happens.
It is a massive anomaly under criterion validity. The researchers tested how the SAOQ scores correlated with the actual frequency of self-awareness practices, things like formal reflection, meditation, or coaching.
Right.
The reflective self-development, acceptance, and emotional cost scores all went up as people engaged in a greater number of those practices. But proactivity at work was entirely unrelated to the frequency of those practices. Let that sink in.
I am aware of the data.
If practically engaging in self-awareness doesn't actually increase your score on this subscale, how can we legitimately classify workplace proactivity as an outcome of self-awareness?
Because you are assuming a strictly linear causal relationship where one might not exist in such simple terms. Engaging in formal self-awareness practices, like sitting on a meditation cushion, is not the only mechanism by which a person develops insight.
But it is the primary intervention.
Someone might be highly proactive at work because their professional environment is a trial by fire. It forces constant self-monitoring, immediate feedback loops, and rapid adaptation. Their proactivity is their self-awareness in motion, even if they never sit down to formally meditate or write in a journal. The workplace itself is the intervention.
But that interpretation completely destroys the theoretical framework of the questionnaire. The handbook explicitly states the SAOQ can be used to measure the specific effects of self-awareness interventions or training programs. Let's look at the real-world application here. Say I am an HR manager and I run a massive, expensive mindfulness seminar for my team.
Okay, a common scenario.
Afterward, my employees' proactivity scores don't budge because, as the data shows, those scores are unrelated to practices. The SAOQ makes my intervention look like a total failure. Furthermore, the instructions explicitly state that if the respondent sample is unemployed, you simply remove the proactive at-work items from the test altogether, which is a perfectly reasonable, pragmatic adjustment for the sample demographic. You can't ask an unemployed person how they manage their office workflow, but think about what that means for the underlying science. If you can just lop off a quarter of the questionnaire because someone doesn't have a job, it suggests this is a circumstantial behavior, not a fundamental outcome of a core psychological trait. What the researchers have actually done is take a completely different psychological construct, let's call it worker autonomy or maybe conscientiousness, and simply staple that onto self-awareness. It is a dilution of the core concept.
It is not a dilution. It is one facet of a multidimensional construct. Look, you are looking for a singular, perfect metric, but human behavior at work is highly contextual. The data shows that these specific proactive behaviors strongly cluster together among working professionals who exhibit high self-awareness. The tool is simply reflecting the reality that insight manifests differently in a boardroom than it does in a living room.
And this confusion over what legitimately constitutes an outcome leads me directly to my biggest conceptual concern, which is the overall stability of the SAOQ's framework. The HR example shows how messy these outcomes get, which brings us to the messiest one of all, the emotional costs factor.
I actually think the inclusion of emotional costs is one of the most vital, courageous contributions of this tool.
Well, it certainly raises fundamental questions about what we are actually measuring. This subscale includes items like item 4, I find it scary to try something new or step out of what I know, and item 8, I feel vulnerable. Now, there is a glaring contradiction in the evolution of this tool.
You're bringing up the AOM.
Yes, the 2023 development, the original 2016 SAOQ, included these emotional costs as a core pillar. Yet in the 2023 development by Sutton and Medvedev, they created the Awareness Outcomes Measure, or AOM, which evaluates only positive outcomes.
Because it was designed for a different...
If you can just surgically remove the negative effects from a subsequent measure, it deeply suggests that emotional costs were never an intrinsic part of the self-awareness construct to begin with. You are just picking and choosing which side effects to count based on what is convenient for the researcher at the time.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the absolute necessity of capturing that psychological friction. The creation of the AOM doesn't invalidate the original 2016 SAOQ, nor does it invalidate the later SAOQ-R, which specifically provides a robust, internationally validated version that retains the negative outcomes.
They retain them, but it's inconsistent.
They simply serve different research purposes, but I will fiercely defend the original SAOQ precisely because it refuses to sanitize the human experience. Self-awareness is not always a warm, fuzzy journey of enlightenment.
I'm not saying it is.
It is often terrifying, and the demographic data from the 1,164 respondents in the normative sample prove this is a real profound phenomenon.
The demographic data is certainly extensive. I will grant you that.
It is definitive. Let's look at the age breakdown because it perfectly illustrates the mechanism at play. Respondents under 18 years old scored the highest on emotional costs out of any group, an average score of 3.57. But here is the critical part. They also scored the highest on reflective self-development, hitting 4.16.
Right.
So what does that data actually prove? It proves something profound. Cognitive growth physically hurts. Teenagers are rapidly expanding their mental maps of reality. They are figuring out their social hierarchies, and for the first time, they are recognizing their own deep flaws. The friction of that expansion manifests as high emotional cost. To strip that vulnerability out of a measurement of self-awareness is to completely ignore the reality of human development.
See, I interpret that data very differently. It tells us that teenagers under 18 are emotionally volatile, highly self-conscious, and prone to feeling vulnerable. Their prefrontal cortexes are still developing. We already knew that.
That is deeply reductive. The data tracks across international lines too, capturing the cultural friction of introspection in different societies.
But you have to ask, is the awareness causing the distress, or is the distress triggering the awareness? Or, more likely, are both simply symptoms of developmental instability? If a teenager says, I feel vulnerable, and simultaneously says, I understand my emotions, the SAOQ scores both of those as direct outcomes of self-awareness. But feeling vulnerable is just a state of being human, particularly an adolescent human. We are taking the messy, chaotic reality of human emotion and retroactively labeling it a self-awareness outcome. It is, once again, circular logic.
It's not circular. It is comprehensive. When you develop self-awareness, you necessarily encounter your own limitations. Item 13 is literally, I'm aware of my abilities and limitations. Recognizing a limitation often induces a feeling of vulnerability. The tool is simply honest enough to record the cost of that insight rather than pretending growth is painless.
Honesty is admirable, sure, but psychometric validity requires strict boundaries. If you define every complex feeling a reflective person has as an outcome of reflection, the construct loses all structural integrity. Suddenly, everything from workplace efficiency to adolescent existential dread is lumped into one questionnaire.
Okay, let's summarize where we stand because I think we've mapped out the exact borders of this tension pretty well. I firmly believe that the SAOQ's four-factor outcome model provides an essential, highly practical framework for capturing the lived experience of self-awareness. By looking at reflective self-development, acceptance, proactivity, and yes, the emotional costs, we stop treating self-awareness as an invisible ghost in the machine.
A ghost that's very hard to pin down.
Exactly. We look at its actual footprints in a person's life. Is the self-report mechanism flawless? No. But it is the most psychometrically reliable way to measure the good, the bad, and the practical impacts of introspection across a broad population.
And my stance remains that measuring outcomes via self-report still suffers from circular logic. When we rely on individuals to rate their own insight using items like, I understand myself well, and when we include variables like workplace proactivity that do not even respond to actual self-awareness practices, we risk blurring the lines.
Blurring them how?
We blur the lines between true metacognitive self-awareness and entirely distinct traits like worker autonomy or emotional anxiety. The methodological paradox of measuring the mind with the mind is still very much there, and relying on circumstantial outcomes just doesn't solve it.
Though I think we can both agree that Anna Sutton's work, whether you love the methodology or question it, exposes the sheer magnificent complexity of operationalizing an internal state. The demographic variations in the source data alone are a goldmine for future psychologists.
Oh, without a doubt.
For instance, female scoring measurably higher on emotional costs, 3.46, compared to males at 3.32. That points to profound cultural and psychological differences in how self-insight is experienced, socialized, and internalized.
Absolutely. The rich demographic data proves that whatever the SAOQ is capturing, whether it is pure self-awareness or a broader constellation of human traits, it is highly sensitive to the realities of gender, age, and environment. The complexity is undeniable, and the data set is a tremendous contribution to the field of psychology, pushing us to ask harder questions.
And understanding human self-insight requires accepting its paradoxes. The 2025 paper by Sutton and Carey on overcoming the paradox of measuring self-awareness development by focusing on outcomes proves there is still so much more to explore in this material. The conversation isn't over, the science is still evolving. So we leave you to think about the rustling leaves of your own behaviors and the footprints you leave in your own life. Are you truly as self-aware as your own outcomes suggest?